Alright, let's go. Number 10. The hard problem of consciousness. In 1994, a young Australian philosopher named David Chalmers was doing something unglamorous. He was trying to organize a field. Consciousness research at the time was a scattered mess of neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy, and Chalmers, trained in mathematics at Adelaide before defecting to philosophy in Douglas Hofstadter's lab in Indiana, wanted a taxonomy. A list of problems sorted by difficulty so the science could get to work. The assumption running through cognitive science was clean. Explain the function, and you have explained the mind. Explain how the brain discriminates wavelengths, integrates information, controls behavior, reports its own internal states, and consciousness falls out of the explanation as a bonus. This was not a fringe view. It was the operating assumption of an entire discipline. Chalmers sorted the problems and found a residue. Something left over that no functional explanation touched. Every one of those problems could be solved completely, and you would still not have said why any of it is accompanied by experience. He named it in a talk at the first Tucson conference in April 1994, then published it as Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, Volume 2, Number 3, in 1995. Pages 200 to 219. He called the functional problems easy, not because they were simple, but because we know what a solution would look like. The remainder he called the hard problem. 31 years later, the paper has been cited more than 9,000 times and the hard problem has not moved. The responses arrived quickly and each one failed in a different direction. Daniel Dennett's answer in Consciousness Explained, published in 1991, was to deny there was anything left to explain, a move critics called explaining away rather than explaining. Identity theory from U.T. Place in 1956 and J.J.C. Smart in 1959 asserted that experience simply is brain process, which restates the mystery as a brute fact. Higher-order thought theories, developed by David Rosenthal, explain awareness of a state but not the feel of the state being aware. Emergence was proposed, then noticed to be a label for the gap rather than a bridge across it. Every red you have ever seen, every ache, the particular quality of this moment as it arrives. Physics can tell you which neurons fired and cannot tell you why the firing was accompanied by anything at all. Why is there something it is like to be you rather than nothing? The next entry tried to answer that question with a number. Number 9. The Phi anomaly. Giulio Tononi was a sleep researcher. That is the crucial detail. Working at the University of Wisconsin, he was studying a mundane clinical puzzle. Why does consciousness vanish in dreamless sleep when the neurons are still firing at nearly waking rates? Total activity barely drops. The person is gone anyway. The expectation was that consciousness would track neural activity. More firing, more experience. That is what almost every measure in neuroscience assumed, and it is what electrode counts and metabolic scans were built to detect. What Tononi found was that activity was the wrong variable. In deep sleep, the cortex fires plenty, it just stops integrating. Stimulate one region and the response dies locally instead of propagating. So he inverted the entire approach and defined consciousness as integrated information itself, quantified by a single number, phi. The theory appeared as an information integration theory of consciousness in BMC Neuroscience, Volume 5, Article 42, in 2004, with version 3.0 published by Masafumi Oizumi, Larissa Albantakis, and Tononi in PLOS Computational Biology in 2014. It works clinically. The perturbational complexity index derived from it distinguishes conscious from unconscious patients with better than 90% accuracy. Then, in 2014, Scott Aronson at MIT constructed a simple grid of logic gates implementing an expander graph and calculated its phi. It was enormous, larger than a human being's. The escape routes were all taken and all failed. Adding a complexity requirement to exclude the grid was arbitrary, with no principled cutoff. Restricting phi to biological substrates abandoned the theory's entire claim to generality. Computing phi exactly turned out to be intractable for anything larger than a toy system, so the number that defines consciousness cannot be measured in the thing it was built to explain. Tononi's own response was the one nobody expected. He accepted the conclusion. The grid is conscious. In 2023, 124 researchers signed an open letter calling the theory unfalsifiable. That same year, the Cogitate adversarial collaboration tested it head-to-head against its main rival and confirmed neither. The best mathematical theory of why anesthesia works also implies a wall of wire in an empty warehouse might be experiencing something. If a number can be conscious, what is it that the number is measuring? The next theory abandoned numbers and reached for a metaphor instead. Number 8. The empty spotlight. Bernard Bars spent the 1980s studying slips of the tongue, speech errors, why a person says one word while intending another, and why some mental content becomes reportable while the vast majority never does. Routine cognitive psychology aimed at a narrow question about language production. The architecture he built from it was elegant. The brain is a massive parallel system of specialized unconscious processors, competing for access to a limited capacity broadcast channel. Whatever wins the competition gets distributed globally to every other module. That broadcast is consciousness. Everything else runs in the dark. The model made real predictions, and they held. Then it hit the same wall as everything else on this list. It explains which contents get broadcast. It says nothing about why broadcasting feels like anything. Bars published a cognitive theory of consciousness with Cambridge University Press in 1988. Stanislas Dehaene, Michel Kersberg, and Jean-Pierre Changeux gave it a neural implementation in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Volume 95, in 1998, identifying a prefrontal parietal ignition event roughly 300 milliseconds after stimulus onset, visible as the P3B wave. Each defense collapsed under a different test. Equating reportability with consciousness was undermined by no-report paradigms, reviewed by Natsugu Tsuchiya, Melanie Wilke, Stefan Frussel, and Victor Lame in Trends in Cognitive Sciences in 2015, where sensory cortex showed conscious type activity with no report at all. Lame's recurrent processing theory placed experience earlier, before any broadcast. Michael Pitts and colleagues argued the P3B tracks post-perceptual decision, not perception. And the 2023 Cogitate collaboration found prefrontal signatures weaker than the theory required. The spotlight metaphor has a hole in the middle of it. A spotlight illuminates something for someone. The theory describes the light in the stage and never once locates the audience. Who is the broadcast being sent to? Theory is one thing. Operating theaters are another. Number 7. The connected consciousness problem. In 1970, 3 anesthetists at Liverpool, D.D., Bryce, R.R. Hetherington, and J.E. Utting, ran a piece of routine quality assurance. They interviewed patients after surgery with a short, structured questionnaire, expecting to document dreaming and reassure themselves that general anesthesia did what it claimed. General anesthesia was understood as the reliable off switch for consciousness. Agents like propofol and the volatile halogenated ethers potentiate GABA-A receptors, cortical connectivity fragments. The EEG slows into burst suppression. Nothing is experienced, because there is no one there to experience it. That is the entire premise of modern surgery. Some patients remembered. Not dreams, the operation. Conversations, Pressure, Paralysis, Rolf Sondin, and colleagues at Kalmar County Hospital published a prospective study in The Lancet in 2000, covering 11,785 patients, finding 18 cases of awareness and incidence of 0.15%. J.D. Pandit's NAP5 audit in 2014 reviewed roughly 3 million anesthetics across the UK and Ireland and found spontaneous reports at about 1 in 19,600. Then Robert Sanders and colleagues published in Anesthesiology in 2017 using the isolated forearm technique, a cuff keeping one arm unparalyzed, and found that 12 of 260 patients, 4.6%, responded to spoken command after intubation. Every explanation narrowed and none closed. Underdosing was ruled out in patients monitored with processed EEG. Genetic drug resistance explains outliers, not a rate near 1 in 20. False memory cannot apply, because the forearm response is measured live, not recalled. Implicit memory reframes the recall problem without touching the response. The field's own resolution was to coin a new term, connected consciousness, which concedes that experience occurred and only the recording failed. The gap between the two numbers is roughly 900-fold. The difference between them is memory, not awareness. If you have had surgery, which number applied to you? If the surgery can leave you awake, other surgeries did stranger things. Number 6. The divided self. In the early 1960s, Joseph Bogan and Philip Vogel at the White Memorial Medical Center in Los Angeles were treating patients with intractable epilepsy by severing the corpus callosum. The aim was seizure control and nothing else. Roger Sperry and his graduate student Michael Gazzaniga tested the patients afterwards as standard neurological follow-up. The expectation was minimal change. Earlier calosotomy patients had shown almost no deficit in ordinary behavior. One brain, one patient, one person walking out of the ward. Then they controlled which hemisphere received the information. The left hand began unbuttoning what the right hand had buttoned. Patients denied seeing objects their left hand could correctly select. Gazzaniga, Bogan, and Sperry published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 1962. Sperry took the Nobel Prize in 1981. In Gazzaniga's chicken claw experiments, the left hemisphere invented reasons for choices the right hemisphere had made. On demand, without hesitation, the process he named the interpreter in 1978. Then, Yair Pinto and colleagues published in Brain, Volume 140, Issue 5, in 2017, testing 2 patients and finding no response conflict across the midline, perception divided. Consciousness apparently unified. Neither reading survives the full dataset. 2 separate persons contradicts Pinto's findings and the patient's own reports of undivided selfhood. One person with split perception cannot explain 2 hands pursuing opposing goals. Preserved subcortical roots might carry unity, but then the lateralized deficits should not be so sharp. And the interpreter hypothesis solves it only by making unity a fabrication, a narrative generated after the fact. That last option is the one that reaches you. The interpreter is not damaged tissue. It is standard equipment, running in your skull right now, explaining your decisions to you after they are made. Is the person you take yourself to be a fact? Or a story your left hemisphere is telling? Divided brains raise a question about undivided ones. Number 5. The inverted spectrum. John Locke was not doing philosophy of mind when he found this. He was writing a technical chapter on true and false ideas for the essay Concerning Human Understanding, published in 1689, Book 2, Chapter 32. Working through how words attach to ideas so that 2 speakers can mean the same thing. The assumption underneath language is that shared vocabulary implies shared experience. You say the tomato is red. I agree. We take that agreement to mean something about what each of us is seeing. Locke noticed the agreement is empty. If your experience of red were systematically swapped with your experience of blue from birth, you would still call the tomato red, still call the sky blue, still pass every test. Sidney Shoemaker formalized it in The Inverted Spectrum in the Journal of Philosophy in 1982. Stephen Palmer's target article in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, Volume 22, Issue 6. In 1999 argued that asymmetries in color space make red-green inversion detectable, while conceding that a restricted class of inversions remains undetectable in principle. Martine Nita Armelin, writing in Philosophical Studies in 1996, described pseudo-normal vision, a condition arising from swapped cone photopigment genes estimated at roughly 14 in 10,000 males, whose bearers may be behaviorally normal actual inverts. Every proposed test dissolves on inspection. Color space asymmetry eliminates some inversions and leaves others intact. Functionalism declares inversion incoherent by defining experience as functional role, which then makes the next entry on this list unanswerable. Neural comparison fails because identical neural states across 2 skulls cannot be established, and correlation would not settle the question if they could. Behavioral testing is ruled out by definition. The scenario is constructed to be behaviorally silent. You have never verified that another human being has seen what you have seen. Not once. Not with anyone you love. What if nobody you have ever spoken to about color was describing the same thing? One philosopher built that doubt into an argument physicalism still has not survived. Number 4. The knowledge argument. Frank Jackson, working in Australia in the early 1980s, was not trying to overturn the scientific worldview. He was trying to make a stubborn intuition precise enough to be argued about that there seems to be something about experience that physical description leaves out. He built a thought experiment to test it. Physicalism holds that all facts are physical facts. If that is true, then someone who knows every physical fact about a system knows every fact about it. There is no residue, no extra ingredient. Jackson imagined Mary, a brilliant scientist raised in a black and white room, who learns every physical fact about color vision, wavelengths, opsins, V4, every neural pathway. Then the door opens and she sees a red tomato. He published it as Epiphenomenal Qualia in the Philosophical Quarterly, Volume 32, number 127, in 1982, pages 127 to 136, and sharpened it in What Mary Didn't Know in the Journal of Philosophy in 1986. If she learns anything at all, physicalism is incomplete. 4 decades of replies have not settled it. The ability hypothesis of David Lewis and Lawrence Nemeroff says Mary gains know-how, not knowledge, but she can recognize red on sight, and recognition is propositional. The phenomenal concept strategy developed by Brian Lohr in 1990 says she learns an old fact in a new way, which concedes a concept physics cannot derive. Dennett's Robo-Mary asserts she would already know, without demonstrating it. Paul Churchland's 1985 reply charges an equivocation on knows that its critics say relocates the problem rather than removing it. And in 2003, Jackson publicly abandoned his own argument and became a physicalist, while conceding he still could not explain away the intuition that drove it. Everything you will ever learn about your own brain, and you would still have had to be there. What exactly did Mary learn when the door opened? Some thinkers concluded the problem lies not in the brain, but in matter itself. Number 3. The panpsychist turn. Arthur Eddington was an astrophysicist doing the most concrete work imaginable: stellar structure, the internal constitution of stars, the 1919 eclipse measurements that tested general relativity, physics as measurement. In preparing his Gifford lectures, he stopped to ask a question about what his equations actually described. The standard view is that physics gives a complete account of matter. Mass, charge, spin, position, nothing left over. Whatever the brain is doing, it is doing with these ingredients and no others. Eddington's observation, published in The Nature of the Physical World in 1928, was that physics specifies only structure and relations. What mass does, never what mass is. The intrinsic nature of matter is nowhere in the equations. Bertrand Russell made the same point in The Analysis of Matter in 1927. Galen Strawson revived it as realistic monism, Why Physicalism Entails Panpsychism in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, Volume 13 in 2006, published with 17 peer commentaries. Philip Goff developed it in Consciousness and Fundamental Reality with Oxford University Press in 2017. Chalmers and Christoph Koch have both treated it as a live option rather than mysticism. Then the theory hit a wall it built itself. The combination problem, stated by William James in the Principles of Psychology in 1890, points out that 100 small feelings do not add up to one larger feeling. Subjects do not sum. Constitutive panpsychism offers no mechanism for how micro-experiences compose a unified mind. Cosmopsychism inverts the direction and inherits a decomposition problem instead. Panprotopsychism posits properties defined as unknowable in principle. Emergentism returns you to entry number 10. The atoms in your hand were forged in a star and have been circulating for 13 billion years. This theory says the difference between them and you may be arrangement, not kind. If experience is fundamental, why does yours feel like one thing? Others kept the problem inside the brain and immediately lost the object. Number 2. The binding problem. Christoph von der Malsburg at the Max Planck Institute for Biophysical Chemistry in Göttingen in 1981 was working on an engineering constraint in neural network models, A network representing two objects at once smears their features together, what he called the superposition catastrophe. A modeling nuisance. The brain processes visual features in separate places. Orientation in V1, color in V4, motion in area MT. Different regions, different latencies, no anatomical convergence zone where the streams reunite. Decades of searching found no such sight. You see one moving red object anyway. Unified, instantaneous, seamless, assembled by a mechanism nobody can locate. Charles Gray, Peter Nigg. Andreas Engel and Wolf Singer reported 40 Hz synchronization across cat visual cortex in Nature, volume 338, pages 334 to 337, in 1989, and Francis Crick and Christoph Koch built a consciousness hypothesis on it in seminars in the neurosciences in 1990. Anne Treisman and Gary Gelade had already shown in cognitive psychology in 1980 that binding fails under divided attention, producing illusory conjunctions, the wrong color attached to the wrong shape. The candidate solutions were dismantled one by one. Michael Shadlin and J. Anthony Mouvshon's Synchrony Unbound in Neuron in 1999 argued that synchrony carries no information, and that no neuron has been found that reads it out. Alexander Thiele and Gene Stoner reported in Nature in 2003 that MT synchrony did not track perceptual binding at all. Attention as the binding agent is too slow and too serial for ordinary vision. Dedicated convergence cells face combinatorial explosion and have never been found. Declaring the problem dissolved requires that nobody needs to see the assembled scene, which reinstates the homunculus it was meant to remove. Konstantinos Moutousis and Samir Zeki showed in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B in 1997 that color is perceived roughly 80 milliseconds before motion. Your present moment is stitched together from signals that never arrive together. The seam is perfect, and there is no seamstress. Who is doing the stitching? One proposal claims the stitching happens far below the neuron. Number 1. The orchestrated reduction. Roger Penrose was not looking for consciousness. He was working on two unrelated technical problems at Oxford, the measurement problem in quantum mechanics and the implications of Dell's incompleteness theorems for formal systems. Mathematics, not neuroscience. The consensus was that the brain is a classical computer. Neurons as switches, synapses as weights, everything above the molecular scale governed by ordinary thermodynamics. At 310 Kelvin, in warm salt water, quantum coherence is impossible. That was not a hypothesis. It was considered a boundary condition. Penrose argued that human mathematical understanding grasps truths no consistent formal system can prove, and concluded the underlying process must be non-computable, requiring new physics, an objective collapse driven by gravitational self-energy, with collapse time given by E equals h bar over T. Stewart-Hameroff, an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona. Supply to location, microtubules, the tubulin lattices inside neurons, chosen because anesthetic gases bind to hydrophobic pockets in exactly those proteins. Their joint model appeared in 1996 in the Journal of Consciousness Studies and in Mathematics and Computers and Simulation, Volume 40. Max Tegmark's calculation in Physical Review E, Volume 61, page 4194. In 2000 gave microtubule decoherence times around 10 to the minus 13 seconds, 10 orders of magnitude too fast to matter. Scott Hagen, Hameroff, and Jack Taziski recalculated in Physical Review E, Volume 65, Article 0619, Row 1, in 2002 and got 10 to the minus 5 seconds. Solomon Pfefferman's Critique in Psyche in 1995 rejected the Galilean premise outright, since human mathematicians are not consistent formal systems. Then the experiments started arriving anyway. Anirban Bandyopadhyay's group reported resonant conductance in single microtubules in Applied Physics Letters in 2013. Luca Turin and Efthymios Skoulakis reported a xenon isotope effect on anesthetic potency in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2014. Nuclear spin changing how well the gas works. And in 2024, Mike Weist's group at Wellesley published in a Neuro showing that ipothalone B, a microtubule stabilizer, delayed anesthetic-induced unconsciousness in rats by roughly a minute. The drug that switches you off may be reaching something inside your cells that physics has no vocabulary for. If consciousness is quantum, what happens to it when the collapse stops? Every entry on this list sits at the center of our most tested science, not at its edges. Anesthesia works. Callosotomy works. The visual cortex is mapped to the column. We can predict, measure, and manipulate the brain with extraordinary precision, and we cannot say why any of it is accompanied by experience. The universe is not confused about what it is doing. We are the ones who cannot find ourselves in the equations, and we are the only thing we have ever had direct access to. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now.